As of this moment, I'm an international fugitive. By filming this scene on this patch of dirt, I'll be joining the ranks of hundreds of journalists and politicians who just wanted to come and witness a world between masters, a war zone. And if I said I was a tourist and that I was confused and that I completely agree to Azerbaijan's natural right to this land, they might just let me get away with it. I might slip under the radar, but I'm not going to do that. So for the rest of my life, a dictatorship with a litany of human rights abuses is going to be waiting to throw me in prison. Because that's what it takes to tell this story. And if that's what they'll do to me, imagine what it's like living here. What gives you the right to live where you are? To sell your land, to grow your crops, to raise your children in a place that you think is yours. What gives you that right? It might sound like a complicated answer, but it's actually quite simple. It's force. Guns. Every law we've ever made, every agreement we've ever come to, every nation carved out of the dust, it's all guns. Might makes right. No matter how peaceful your nation may be, the only reason you're there is because of guns. The people of Karabakh understand a world where force can take away everything in an instant. They're indigenous to this region and have likely lived here for over 10,000 years. This area of the Caucasus is so closely associated with their inhabitation that it's deemed Greater Armenia in almost every language on earth. Whether you call it Ararat, Urarti, Ermeni, Mini, Armenia, or Haik, they've been here so long that the Old Testament treats them as ancient. Armenians fought Babylon. They fought Pompey Magnus and Alexander of Macedon. They fought Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, and the Mamluks. They trembled before the Ottomans and Stalinist Russia. Their entire history is a history of dying so that other people can live. And within that world of war, the region of Karabakh is the only place where they've never been completely forced from their land. While elsewhere in the region that bears their name, exile and genocide have driven them from their ancestral homes, in the Karabakh, they've never truly left. The people here call themselves donkeys because they're so stubborn. Nobody tells them what to do, not even Mother Armenia. The EU doesn't recognize them as a nation. Russia doesn't recognize them as a nation. The US doesn't recognize them as a nation. But they're still here. And if you want to remove them, you're going to need some serious guns. Unfortunately, Azerbaijan has those guns, and they're not afraid to use them. Because they too think this land is theirs, and they've spent more money than Armenia could ever dream of to convince the governments of the world that they're right. To understand how it got to this point though, let's go back a bit in history. Although this story goes back thousands of years and this region has seen independence and destruction on loop a dozen times or more, for the sake of brevity, I'm going to focus on the last few generations alone. At the outset of World War I and the Russian Revolution, Armenians faced a historically difficult situation. To the east, a Turkish nationalist uprising had started a slaughter of minorities so brutal it led to the creation of the word genocide. To the south, a collapsed Persian Empire that had once served as a protector of the Armenian people was crushed by the weight of its own internal divisions. And to the north, the Russian Revolution was in full swing, replacing the dictatorial Tsar with a dictatorial Soviet. In the middle of this were a people with a little identity to call their own. They'd spent so long in other empires, split between rulers, that they barely saw themselves as a people. The genocide changed that. Depending on who you believe, Ottomans killed between 30 and 70% of all Armenians. And yet, even with those numbers, people from just a few hundred miles away would have been completely unaware it was even happening. It remains one of the most denied atrocities in history. Turkey is so opposed to it becoming internationally recognized that they even murdered one of their own journalists for suggesting reconciliation. In 2007, no less. But as awful as it was, it hardened those who survived it. The Armenians have a saying, "We fight ourselves until the knife touches the bone, then we unite." And in the face of mass ethnic cleansing, a people separated by borders, language, and history began to once again see themselves as united. The knife was touching the bone. And out of this garden watered with blood, a hero arose. Geragan Nezhda is perhaps the most important man in modern Armenian history. He was the nationalist spark that lit the fire of independence. His writings, actions, and political will aimed to stave off the complete collapse of his people and to create a state to call their own. It would be no exaggeration to say that his writings changed the world. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians who'd imagined themselves as nothing more than Soviets woke up to their identity. For Armenians in Moscow, Baku, Turkey, America, Argentina, and everywhere else they'd been exiled, his words rang out like a bell. Come together, defend your people, fight until you're free. And for the briefest few months in 1921, he'd run an independent republic here in the hills. But as strong as Nezhde was, he couldn't change the world. A few thousand civilian soldiers cannot stop a superpower, no matter how zealous they are. But that didn't mean he ran. This wasn't a politician in exile telling his boys back home to die for his cause. He was leading from the front lines, and he would fight anyone who took away his idea of independence. He fought the Turks with the Tsar, and he fought the Soviets with Hitler. It didn't matter who his allies were, so long as they said when the dust settled, his people would have a homeland. But promises are nothing without the guns to back them up, and no foreign nation was willing to spill their blood for the Karabakh. For the next decade, change came rapidly to the Caucasus, setting the basis for a conflict that rages right up to the modern day. As the Russian Revolution pulled back the armies of the Tsar, age-old ethnic clashes began to crop up in eastern Armenia and Azerbaijan. British oil interests had long since led them to ally with the Azeri, and war politics were nothing if not harsh. The British designated Karabakh a disputed territory and agreed to look the other way if the Azerbaijani felt they wanted to make it theirs. In turn, they expected them to hold back the oncoming Soviets when the time came. It was nearly 95% Armenian. But it wasn't as simple as a British decree. The World War may have ended, but here war was only beginning. In the face of an ongoing genocide in the West, Nezhde and his local donkeys disagreed wholesale to the loss of their historic homeland in the East. They were ready to fight to the death, and the British and Azerbaijani would make them live up to their word. In 1920, the Karabakh capital of Shusha, then one of the most prosperous towns in the entire Transcaucasus, was razed to the ground, its entire population raped and murdered on the spot. Within all this turmoil, Soviets with the backing of an up-and-coming Joseph Stalin began eyeing the old empire of the Tsar and sent the Red Army down through the Caucasus. To gain favor with the Armenians, they promised the return of Karabakh in exchange for support and soldiers. But like most things in communist Russia, what was promised didn't quite meet reality. The new leader of nationalist Turkey, commonly known as Ataturk, had hinted that he might make friends with the isolated Soviet Russian government, and in turn, they felt like they might make a good communist out of him. So in spite of historic ties, a near 100% Armenian population, and the Communist Central Committee having voted the day before to unite it with Armenia, on July 5, 1921, Stalin handed the region of Karabakh to the newly created, heavily Turkic Soviet Azerbaijan. It was a decision that surely everyone knew would end in bloodshed. For the next 60 years, the Armenians watched as Azerbaijani settlers came to set up a life in the Karabakh, a land they would soon too call their home. And for 60 years, the Armenians protested, only to be crushed again and again by the unapologetic Red Army. In 1988, as Soviet power was coming to a close, the Armenians began a protest that would rip the scar into an open wound. Pogroms, extrajudicial murder, and open hostility were everywhere. There were no good guys. From eastern Armenia to Azerbaijan, sweeping from Stepanakert down to Baku, ethnic cleansing that had been dormant for generations was brought back to the surface. The Soviets didn't intervene. They waited until it was all said and done. After all, they just wanted to control the government. They didn't really care for the people. Hundreds of thousands of refugees fled to the region most likely to keep them alive. Armenians, Azeri, Yazidi, Tatar, Georgians, Persians, all of them. They made the hard choice. You run or you die. In 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed around them, the remaining people of Nagorno-Karabakh held a referendum to form an independent state. With the Azeri abstaining, the vote was nearly unanimous. But while the republics of the Soviet Union were in theory allowed to vote themselves into existence, they'd never considered the Karabakh a republic. On paper, it belonged to Azerbaijan, and even though Russia, now worried about an Islamic state, would send troops to fight for the Armenians, they wouldn't recognize their right to Artsakh. Fear of Turkish intervention was so strong that not even Armenia would recognize their fledgling little brother in the east. The republic was deemed illegal, and the Azeri declared war. It was a war that they'd lose. Nearly 30 years after the outset of that war, and the borders remain roughly as they ever were. Multiple years of total blockade, fighting with handmade weapons against jihadist mercenaries from across the Muslim world, and yet they've barely moved an inch. Azerbaijan's military budget is larger than the entire GDP of Artsakh, yet they still can't take this land. The human rights abuses are constant, without end. The Azeri have enlisted the help of men coming back from their time in ISIS, bringing with them the horrible lessons of Syria and Iraq. It's become commonplace for them to carve up the living soldiers they capture, sending back their bodies while posting Facebook photos of their severed heads. They've systematically destroyed cultural artifacts in ancient churches. They know history supports the Armenians, so they destroy the history. They've dropped mines with colorful ribbons attached, meant to be picked up by children, colloquially naming them after Kinder Surprise eggs. Elderly citizens are being murdered in their homes by special forces, and the Azeri dictatorship is giving medals to those who commit these atrocities. But for all the terror they've caused, it's backfiring. What they can't see is that an animal fights harder the further it's pushed up against the wall. Just ask these donkeys. Today, not a single country on earth recognizes the Republic of Artsakh. The rights of the people of Karabakh simply aren't as important as the geopolitics of superpowers. The UN may say that indigenous people have rights, but to quote Joseph Stalin, how many divisions do they have? Baku has oil and lots of it. Turkey's in NATO, they're fighting in Syria, and they control the flow of refugees to Europe. Nobody is trading that alliance for a few thousand people in the hills. So, the Republic of Artsakh waits. They bide their time building the trappings of a state. They've built museums and statues. They've built children's playgrounds and universities. They've built a foreign ministry. Because they're waiting for the world to change. And they believe that someday people will see them for what they are. They believe that someday history will matter. But until that day, they're going to be right here, defending what's theirs with a gun. This is Rare Earth.